I'd like to think that everybody's here to see me, but I think it's because of the topic as much as anything else. So I've been encouraging my colleagues across campus that when they want people to attend their talks, they should put the word Trump in the title. So there's a talk next week in the chemistry department called The Periodic Table in Trump. And I'm sure they'll get a large crowd for that. As Donna teased in the introduction, when we think of Trump, the Trump presidency, of course, we think of different. I find myself talking about these kinds of things in class, teaching presidency in Congress, one of my courses this year, this semester, and talking about all the sort of rules or general practices, the commonalities across the years and across presidential administrations. And of course, we go through and we'll say, you know, such and such is a type like this, and such is a type like that. But Trump, we get to Trump, and we can't categorize Trump at all along any of these dimensions. He seems to be a very, very different kind of president, which whatever kind of metric that you're using, this is, of course, no ordinary presidency. And it marks a significant break from the status quo in many ways, as I said. And not only are those breaks of many dimensions, they are pronounced. I mean, these are radical departures from the way we're used to presidents doing these things. And that's why I think a good way to talk about the Trump presidency is one of disruption. It is a disruptive presidency. It changes the status quo so much. And disruption, of course, can be seen as both positive and negative, and I think I would subscribe to the school of thought that there's positive and negative disruption in the form of the Trump presidency. If you think of the synonyms of disruption, all of these words could be used to describe what Trump's doing in the White House. Unruly, disorderly, troublesome, undisciplined, they all seem to be in both a positive and negative way descriptive of Trump's first year. And so what I'm going to do here is just talk a little bit about four kinds of things, four areas of the Trump presidency, and to try to demonstrate this departure from the past in each of these four areas. I think it's four. Trump's style, Trump's policies, Trump's administration and management, and also Trump's policy, and Trump, there's five of them, and Trump for the Republican Party. Let's start with Trump's style. He's not a politician, as you know. This is the first president we've had since Dwight D. Eisenhower who hasn't had political experience. And in fact, Trump is, along with Herbert Hoover, the only president in American history to have neither experience in elected office or military experience, or experience at high rank in the military. And at least Hoover was Secretary of Commerce. So Trump in many ways is different, very different from Hoover as well, as having no real previous political experience. With that different background, of course, comes a very different style. And I think Trump's style comes from two parts of his background. The first is one as, well, both of them are as a businessman, but the first is the sort of sales side of his business background. We think of Trump's business background as being one of running a massive, huge property, real estate empire with many, many different properties worth many, many millions of dollars. But Trump was also a salesman. Not only did he sell his properties and buy and sell his properties, but he sold anything you can think of. If you go on YouTube and search Donald Trump salesman, it will remind you of all of the sales pitches he made in commercials during the 1970s and 1980s. He sold anything from pizza to Diet Pepsi to mattresses, on television, and to all of us. He sold himself, of course, as a presidential candidate as well. And with that came, it was useful for his background as an entertainer. We all know that he spent 12 years running or leading a reality TV show called The Apprentice on television, and he has many very interesting cameos on television shows and movies as well. And of course, if you have that kind of background, that encourages you to take a sort of loud, larger-than-life kind of approach to the way that you do things. And of course, this has been an important part of the Trump presidency. He has a penchant for the dramatic, and theatrical would be an understatement, of course. He's always keeping people interested. So, for example, this is during the campaign. You see in the top left-hand corner there, this is a crowd waiting for Donald Trump to give a talk at one of his rallies. And there is a crowd waiting for Hillary Clinton to give a talk. It seemed very small and disinterested compared to Trump's massive and highly energized crowd. This sort of style, this dramatic style, this penchant for the theatrical, is of course seen nowhere better than in Trump's, again, unprecedented use of the new medium of Twitter. You know Twitter. It's a medium in which you can use 140 characters to directly portray a message that you may have to your audience. It also allows you to embed links or add photographs and videos. And Trump, of course, has been an absolute master of this. And so just to show you some of a great collection of tweets that he's used over the time. He's tweeted about 1,150 times, give or take 2 or 3 tweets now, of course it changes quickly. He tweeted just 14 times this weekend over the Russia investigations alone. But since he's been president, he tweets at all times of day. These are some of my favorites. There's the CNN fake news. CNN has finally been exposed as fake news and garbage journalism. It's about time. That's one of my favorites. There's the one where he's mentioning the NFL protests and the kneeling for the national anthem. Of course, there's the stable genius one, which is one of my my favorite sort of personal characterizations of Trump that he gives to himself. Trump has, and this medium, this is not just self-indulgent. I mean, this has significant impact. Most of the impact, of course, is indirect. Most of the way that we digest Trump tweets are indirectly when the media covers them and tells us. But Trump has a massive number of followers compared to any other individual or any other kind of important public institution in the United States that you could think of. So there's about 48 million Twitter followers now. By the way, Trump follows 45 people, 45 Twitter accounts. He has 48 million followers, but he only chooses to follow 45 himself. Most of us, of course, I don't use, we were talking about that earlier, I don't use Twitter because it would get me in trouble at work. But most people who use Twitter, of course, have trouble getting a handful of followers and follow a lot more people than they are followed by. But you can see here, for purposes of contrast, Trump's followers compared to institutions or media outlets like even New York Times and Fox, and compared to sports personalities and National Basketball Association, National Football League, for example, and of course Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Trump's background, of course, not only though gives him this sort of theatrical, dramatic, larger-than-life, loud personality and presidential style, but he is a businessman as well, so he likes to think of himself as a deal maker. And that, although to some people that personality may be off-putting, the goal, of course, is to get to yes, is to get to a deal and get something done. And of course, I've got up there the cover of his famous book, The Art of the Deal. This is disruptive in many ways because Washington these days isn't used to deals. It's used to gridlock. It's used to stasis. It's used to conflict that goes nowhere. And so Trump is trying to disrupt Whether he's successful or not, we'll get to a bit later on. But I think at least he's trying in some way to disrupt the Washington of the past few decades, one which is, as I said, gridlocked, confrontational as a function of incredible partisanship and ideological polarization. So this chart, for example, shows the distribution of members of the House and Senate in the 114th Congress. We're in the 115th now, which is the last complete Congress that was finished. This measure places people on a scale from -1 to +1 based upon their votes. So it places them in an ideological space from very conservative to very liberal. And you can see in red the Republicans there and principal Republicans, individual principal Republicans placed on the dimension. The same for Democrats. It's the actual, the humps that are of most interest. You can see basically every Republican in both the House and Senate. The darker lines are for the Senate, the lighter ones, and obviously there are more House members are for the House. There is hardly any Republican in the 114th Congress is to the left of any Democrat, or vice versa, any Democrat who is to the right of any Republican. And you can see considerable distances there between people like Paul Ryan, for example, and Nancy Pelosi, his counterpart in the House, or Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, the leaders on the Senate side. Of course, there are limits to the way Trump can transcend this, even though he does like to push himself as a deal maker. He is someone who, although obviously a Republican, is not a mainstream, typical partisan figure. These are Trump's approval ratings, Gallup approval ratings by party from this last month, and the red is Republicans and the blue is Democrats, and you can see the proportion of Republicans who approve of Trump's job is significantly more than those of Democrats, and vice versa. Around 86% of Republicans approve of Trump's job, around 90% of Democrats disapprove. And so Trump, despite his difference and despite his desire perhaps to disrupt old-style partisan polarized politics in the United States, there are limits to what he can do. But he has done deals with Democrats, including famously the deal in September, which completely cut out Senator McConnell and Speaker Ryan in getting continuing resolution passed, debt ceiling kicked down the road, and the hurricane relief bill package passed. He does seem to want to work across the aisle. Again, also famously 10 days ago, preventing the government shutdown. Of course, in that case, he didn't just deal with all the Democrats. He really just dealt with his buddy from New York, Chuck Schumer, there, and left poor Nancy Pelosi to speak on the floor for 8 hours in front of snoozing colleagues like Colleen Hanabusa there about the naughty deal that Donald and Chuck had struck, and left the DACA recipients out in the cold. Trump's administration itself is disruptive. The people that he's picked to be in the administration with him, and this is Trump and his cabinet, although there are some departures, and I'll talk a little bit about the turmoil and the turnover in a second, but people like Tom Price there, of course, have left now. So he picked a number of sort of outsider types that even conventional Republicans might not have picked. Just to give some examples, people like Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education, who's been sort of working on issues of school choice and charter schools and due process on college campuses in a way that I think even maybe some conventional Republican education secretaries wouldn't. Scott Pruitt at EPA, of course, has also been a sort of controversial figure, maybe that a risk-averse Republican president wouldn't have picked to run the Environmental Protection Agency. Even people like Rick Perry. Rick Perry at Energy sort of thought of as this kind of stooge for the oil and gas industry, not least because, obviously, as a former governor of Texas, Perry's bringing what he did in Texas, which is a sort of all-of-the-above energy policy to the White House and to the administration. Perry was a big proponent of alternative energy in Texas, and of course that sort of annoys in many ways many of Trump's opponents because it doesn't fit this sort of basic stereotype that they have of him. Of course, this is an administration that has more generals in it, more high-ranking military personnel than we've seen on both sides of the aisle for a very, very long time, with John Kelly as Chief of Staff, of course, Jim Mattis at Defense, H.R. McMaster as the National Security Advisor. Now, because it's a sort of disruptive administration, it's been difficult to get it and put it into place. And so this chart shows you that, and this is as of the first 100 days, which of course is pretty dated now, but the number of nominations sent across by the administration to the Senate and those that were confirmed. And you can see that Trump lagged all of his immediate predecessors by some considerable distance. And that also was reflected in the number of confirmed. Much of this, I think, is a problem that Trump had because of how different a president he is, or different a presidential candidate he was, and then as different a president as he's become. It was very difficult for him to actually identify people that he wanted to staff the administration with. Normally, Republican and Democratic presidents come in, and there are about 3 obvious candidates for every important appointment position within administration. Presidents will come in and have 1 or 2 people they might want to add to that candidate pool. But Trump didn't have any of that at all, and so he was doing a lot of things on the fly. And of course, a lot of these appointments were also fairly controversial. So this chart shows you the cumulative number of no votes in the first year of administrations for presidential executive branch nominees. And you can see that Trump's, they're cumulative. So you can see that Trump's is obviously for his first term, and not just for his first term, but his first year in his first term. And yet he has roughly 700 accumulated no votes compared to all of his predecessors, who have very, very few. Now, one thing we should say that sort of mitigates against this is, of course, that in 2013, Harry Reid helped create a new rule in the Senate that prevented filibusters against executive appointments. And so the cost of voting against an executive appointment and the ability to actually vote on controversial executive appointments went up. That you were controversial executive appointments in the past didn't even get a floor vote because they were filibustered. So there are a lot of DeVos is a good example, of course. She actually went through on a tie-breaking vote by Vice President Pence. But you get a lot of no votes here, whereas in the past they would have been in the form of filibusters. But nevertheless, I think this is demonstrative of the fact that many of Trump's appointees have been controversial, obviously particularly to Senate Democrats. There is a price to be paid for this kind of disruptive approach, though, to staffing and administration, and that, of course, seems to be in the form of turnover as well. So we've seen a significant number, and I think an atypical number of high-profile executive members turning over here in the first year. Chiefs of Staff, Reince Priebus, of course, Press Secretary Sean Spicer, Steve Bannon, who was sort of obviously a chief advisor to the president, people within the cabinet like Tom Price, who I mentioned before. Trump's policies, of course, are also disruptive as well. In foreign policy, he is a Republican president, but he's taken on a lot of Republican orthodox positions on foreign policy, not least, of course, about trade, where he is currently renegotiating NAFTA, or members of the administration are renegotiating NAFTA. He's taken the sort of this liberal, I mean in the sort of classical sense, liberal American foreign policy that both administrations of both parties have signed on to in the past 60 years, and sort of turned it upside down and decided that we need a more America first rather than globalist kind of foreign policy. So I mentioned that on trade. We see it in national security even, with his positions towards NATO, and we see it, not, of course, a lot on immigration as well. He has taken this unorthodox approach in foreign policy and his combative style to Twitter, and not for foreign audiences as well as American audiences. And of course, he's lashed out against people like Rocket Man, who, of course, the leader of North Korea, but even friends like, or ostensible friends like Prime Minister Theresa May of the United Kingdom, which has led to, with that combative foreign policy substance and his combative foreign policy style, led Trump to be not particularly popular abroad. And so, oh, I went the wrong way there, sorry. So this chart shows you in major countries across the world, or countries where these surveys have been done, people asking, do you have confidence in the current president, Donald Trump, American President Donald Trump, to do the right thing regarding world affairs? These show you the percentage of people in those countries who have said yes. Very rare do you see above 50%. The greener the color, the more confidence the people in that country have in Trump. The yellower the color, the less confidence they have. And you can see that it's in Russia and in some countries in Southeastern Asia and Africa for reasons I'm not entirely sure about, where people have greater confidence. But if you map this over one of Obama and even one of Bush, you would see that the confidence that those citizens of other countries have in the US president is less today than it has ever been. And in this particular chart, oh, and so, by the way, this is working now. This is the kinds of, in those countries, the kinds of adjectives that foreigners apply to Trump. So the green ones, of course, are positive ones, and the yellow ones are negative ones. And you can see arrogant and intolerant is much greater than caring about ordinary people and being well qualified to be president. This has led to people who look at the United States to characterize it as a less desirable place to live. I'm not sure how that can change so much in 1 year, regardless of who the president is. But this is an interesting table that I saw. This is from a company that does nation branding. And apparently within the world of market research, the corporate world, this is an extremely respectable group. And they have they rank countries on the positivity of their brand. And in 2016, according to this, we were number 1. And now in 2017, we're number 6. And presumably that's all attributable to Trump for some reason. But you can see that this is disrupting in some ways, in many ways, our foreign policy and the way we're viewed abroad. On the domestic side, of course, Trump has been disruptive as well. There have been tremendous achievements. There have been significant failures. On the regulatory side, this is a sort of a story that many of you in the room may know about, but generally doesn't get a lot of play in the mainstream media. There have been a significant number of regulations that have been reversed, many important ones as well, which, depending upon what metrics you use, may have saved American consumers and businesses about $8 billion, or will save in annual regulatory costs. There, of course, is the tax cut, the historic in many ways, at least probably the most important tax cut, at least since 1981, at least since 1986, possibly since 1981, tax reform that, most importantly, I think, cut the corporate tax rate significantly, obviously, from 35% to 22%. But there are some other areas where there hasn't been quite the change. We've still got this sort of infrastructure thing out there that no one really knows what it is. The president says he wants a $1.5 trillion revolutionary infrastructure bill passed that will have significant effects on American society, and we're not really sure how that's going to work. And then, of course, oh, and by the way, this is the slide that shows you the number of, this is the opposite to the rules cut. This is the number of new proposed rules. And 2017 here in the Federal Register, you can see it's been going down, but there is a marked decrease in the number of new rules that are being proposed, as well as those that have been cut. But one of the most dramatic failures, of course, was the failure to reverse Obamacare last summer with John McCain's famous thumb down. That catches him just, I couldn't find an actual still of the thumb down, just as he's going to put his thumb down and vote against the skinny Obamacare repeal during the summer. And of course, he's disrupted the Republican Party as well. Trump has proved a challenge, to say the least, I think, to the libertarian wing of the Republican Party with his embracing of the state. And you can see some of this. These are data last week after the Trump budget was released on Monday about projected deficits, both in terms of absolute dollars and in terms of percentage of GDP. The gray line were projections from Trump's budget in 2017, proposed budget. The blue ones are from his proposed budget in 2018. And you can see they've had significant negative effects on annual deficits and accumulated debt, which I think worry many people. He's also, I think, become, and you see the libertarian wing is also sort of struggling with Trump on issues such as immigration as well. I think he's also going to be a challenge for a group of Republicans who seem to be amongst his major supporters, and that is Christian conservatives. Trump's personal foibles and personal history, I think, presents a challenge to many who believe that character counts. A lot of Christian conservatives have been very supportive of Trump, of course. But in the future, when they're trying to make that argument between candidates that the character of the person is very important and should be important to voters, their ability to influence that argument, I think, has been undermined by a sort of whole-scale support of Trump, regardless of some of his personal issues. Trump has also, it looks like, and of course the jury's still out on this, but has may change the party and its demographic makeup. And so here you can see, this is from the exit polls of 2016. This is all voters here, and this is just white voters. The people who supported the Democratic or the Republican candidate based upon their college education. And so in 2016, Clinton won college graduates by 9 percentage points, and Trump won non-college grads by 8 percentage points. And of course, this is even greater amongst white voters. Trump may be, and of course this is still the jury is out, changing some of the sort of basic demographic characteristics of the Republican Party. It's possible it could be ephemeral, and Trump is a blip. But if he's certainly in the short term making the party wider, older, less affluent, and less educated. The question then, of course, becomes, will he succeed? And of course, that, I think, will really be determined by his, whether he is able to keep Republican majorities in Congress and whether he is able to keep the job himself in 2020. 2018 is shaping up to be an interesting year. Trump's approval ratings would suggest, and history, of course, of the way midterms treat presidential parties would suggest that it might be a bad year for Republicans. The Democrats need a net gain of 24 seats in the House. Interestingly enough, Hillary Clinton won 23 House districts which are currently being represented by Republican members. So if the Democrats won all of those, they'd need one more, and of course not lose any of their own to get a majority. They need 2 seats in the Senate, if you take into account, of course, Vice President Pence's tie-breaking vote to win back control of the Senate. Democratic recruitment's been solid. That's bad news as well for Republicans. And there have been a number of Republican retirements, particularly from important committee chair positions in the House. A lot of that's a function of term limits on chairs. But nevertheless, it might be a sort of canary in the coal mine for Republicans coming up in 2018. The Democrats have had, under the radar screen, also a number of very, very dramatic victories in special state legislative elections in very red territory as well. I know those may not be completely translatable to the congressional level, but they certainly are warning signs for Republicans and Trump. And this is Trump's approval rating in December compared to those of other presidents going into the midterm election year. This is those on a chart graphed with the number of seats, the net change in House seats for the president's party. And you can see that Trump's down here, and you can make out a trend there. If you put a regression line through those dots, it would be kind of like that, which is obviously the worse your approval rating is, the more seats your party is going to lose in the House of Representatives. There is some good news, particularly on the Senate side. There's a lot of red states where Democratic incumbents are trying to hold on to their seats. In some of those states, Republicans are kind of cannibalizing each other in competitive primaries, but in places like Missouri and Montana and West Virginia and Indiana, there's possibilities for Republicans to pick up seats. Republicans also have an advantage although Democrats have been outraising Republicans this year, or last year in 2017, they've been burning cash like crazy. And so Republicans, the Republican committees, as far as cash on hand are concerned, are slightly more advantaged than Democrats moving through the early part of 2018. That leaves us with 2020. Obviously, oh, by the way, quote here, just before I get to 2020. It may work for Trump for 2020 if the Democrats actually win back control of Congress. I think particularly if the Democrats win the House, he will have a natural foil in Nancy Pelosi. Presumably she would be the Speaker in the House. And I think that Trump himself is kind of licking his lips. And rather than governing with Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, may actually prefer to run a 2-year campaign against Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. There's a great quote from a speech he gave in Ohio a couple of weeks ago about Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, calling Nancy Pelosi our secret weapon. And I don't think he's far off that. It may actually work for him in 2020 to run against it. Regardless, 2020 will obviously be the real verdict on how the disruptive presidency has worked out. And I leave you with some of his prospective challenges and to make you think a little bit about what the alternatives might be. Anyway, I think I've left enough time for questions.